Albert Speer stood in the ruins of the Third Reich, a broken man surveying the wreckage of everything he had built. The former armaments minister, who had once commanded the industrial might of Nazi Germany, now faced his Allied interrogators with a confession that would echo through history. To construct our defenses in 2 years, he admitted, we used 13 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.5 million tons of steel. A fortnight after the landings by the enemy, this costly effort was brought to nothing because of an idea of simple genius. 13 million cubic meters of concrete, 1.5 million tons of steel, enough material to build a fortress stretching from Berlin to Paris. The combined industrial output of a nation at war poured into defensive positions along the Atlantic coast for 2 years, and it had all been rendered worthless in 14 days. On the morning of June 7, 1944, German defenders along the Normandy coast rubbed their eyes in disbelief. Where the day before there had been only empty ocean and the chaos of invasion beaches, now there appeared something impossible. A fully functioning harbor had materialized overnight, complete with piers stretching half a mile out to sea, massive concrete breakwaters creating sheltered water, and steel roads floating on the waves. Tanks, trucks, and troops were already streaming ashore in an endless procession, as if this harbor had always existed. German observers in their bunkers watched in stunned silence. This was not possible. You could not build a harbor overnight. You could not move a port across 90 miles of contested ocean. The very idea violated everything they understood about military logistics and engineering. And yet, there it was, undeniably real, disgorging the weapons and soldiers that would destroy the Third Reich. The Germans had spent years fortifying every major port along the Atlantic coast precisely because they believed no invasion could survive without capturing one. They had constructed the mightiest defensive network in military history on a single assumption, and that assumption had just been proven catastrophically wrong. This is the story of how the Allies brought their own harbor to war, and in doing so, changed the course of history forever. To understand why the Mulberry Harbors were necessary, you must first understand the logic behind Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The reasoning was not born of arrogance or incompetence. It was a rational response to an undeniable military reality that had governed amphibious warfare for centuries. Beginning in 1942, the Wehrmacht embarked on the most ambitious fortification project since the Great Wall of China. Führer Directive No. 40, issued on March 23 of that year, outlined the strategy in stark terms. The coastline of occupied Europe, from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish border, would be transformed into an impenetrable barrier. But the defensive effort would be concentrated where it mattered most, at the ports. The German High Command believed that any Allied invasion of Western Europe would require immediate capture of a major port. Without harbor facilities to unload heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, and the endless tonnage of supplies needed to sustain a modern army, any beachhead would wither and die within days. This was not opinion, this was mathematical fact. A single infantry division in combat consumed approximately 700 tons of supplies per day. An armored division required even more, factoring in fuel for tanks and ammunition for heavy weapons. An army corps comprising multiple divisions needed thousands of tons. An army group, the scale of force required for a full invasion, demanded tens of thousands of tons, delivered continuously, day after day, regardless of weather or enemy action. Moving such quantities required specialized infrastructure, cranes capable of lifting tanks from ship holds, deep water berths where heavy transports could dock safely, protected anchorages where vessels could shelter from channel storms, warehouses for ammunition storage, rail connections to move supplies inland, roads capable of bearing the weight of military vehicles. You simply could not sustain an invasion army over open beaches. The mathematics were relentless, and the waves would make sustained operations impossible.
Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, built his entire defensive strategy around this premise. He was not a fool. He had commanded armies in Poland, France, and Russia. He understood logistics at a level few generals ever achieve. When he looked at the challenge facing any Allied invasion, he saw the same problem the Allies saw, the unavoidable requirement for port facilities. 15,000 concrete emplacements were constructed along the Atlantic coast. 300,000 soldiers were concentrated at port cities. Cherbourg became a fortress, its harbors bristling with guns, and its approaches mined so thoroughly that even fishing boats risked destruction. Calais was transformed into a death trap, its fortifications so formidable that Allied planners knew any direct assault would be suicidal. Every harbor from Norway to the Spanish border received attention proportional to its military value. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who understood Allied capabilities better than most German commanders, accepted the fundamental logic of the port strategy. When he arrived in France in late 1943 to inspect the Atlantic Wall, his famous criticism that the defenses were cloud cuckoo land was not aimed at the strategy itself. His complaint was about execution. The defenses were incomplete. The beaches between the ports were inadequately fortified. He wanted more obstacles, more mines, more guns everywhere. But he never questioned the core assumption that the Allies would need a major port. The reasoning seemed unassailable, and it had been validated in blood on the shingle beaches of Dieppe. On August 19, 1942, over 6,000 Allied soldiers, primarily Canadian, stormed the French port of Dieppe in Operation Jubilee. The plan called for attacks at 5 points along a 16-kilometer front. British commandos would assault the flanks to destroy coastal gun batteries, while the main Canadian force would storm the town itself, supported by the first operational use of the new Churchill tanks. The element of surprise combined with overwhelming naval and air support would compensate for the formidable German positions. Within hours, the operation had collapsed into chaos. On the eastern flank, the assault force encountered a small German convoy in the darkness before dawn. A sharp sea battle erupted, its gunfire alerting coastal defenders for miles. When the commandos finally reached their beach at Berneval, they found German machine gunners waiting in prepared positions. The slaughter was immediate and total. At Poise, the landing craft arrived late after dawn had already revealed them to enemy observers. Canadian soldiers scrambled onto a beach dominated by cliffs bristling with machine gun positions. They never stood a chance. Of approximately 500 men who landed, fewer than 60 would return to England unwounded. The rest were killed or captured on the beach, many before they could fire a single shot. The main attack on Dieppe itself proved no better. Churchill tanks bogged down in the shingle and became death traps for their crews. Infantry attempting to cross the seawall met interlocking fields of machine gun fire. German artillery zeroed in on the landing craft, destroying them as they tried to evacuate survivors. By afternoon, it was over. The final casualty figures were devastating. Over 3,350 Canadian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. 916 Canadians lost their lives. Many drowned when their landing craft were sunk trying to escape. Nearly 2,000 more marched into captivity. Of the roughly 5,000 Canadians who participated in the assault, more than 60% became casualties in a single day. More Canadians were taken prisoner at Dieppe than in the entire campaign from D-Day to the fall of Germany 2.5 years later. British losses added another 300 killed, wounded, and captured. Naval casualties reached 550. In the air battle overhead, the Royal Air Force lost 106 aircraft, including 13 Canadian planes, the worst single day of losses for the RAF in the entire war. For the German High Command, Dieppe was vindication written in blood. The Allies had attacked a port and been slaughtered. The defensive strategy was working exactly as designed. From Berlin to the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, German officers drew the obvious conclusion. If the Allies could not take a lightly defended port like Dieppe with 6,000 men in a single-day raid, how could they possibly hope to capture the heavily fortified harbors they would need for a full-scale invasion? The logic seemed unassailable. What the Germans did not know was that the catastrophe at Dieppe had planted a seed that would grow into their undoing. In the aftermath of the disaster, as survivors staggered off the ships returning to England and casualty lists spread grief across Canada, Captain John Hughes Howlett faced an impossible question. He had commanded the naval forces at Dieppe. The blood of thousands was on his hands, justified or not, and now he had to explain how any future invasion could possibly succeed. His answer seemed like the ramblings of a man struggling to justify failure. "If we cannot capture a port," he declared at a meeting of the combined chiefs, "we must take one with us." The reaction in the room was predictable: laughter, skepticism, the polite silence that greets suggestions too absurd to dignify with argument. A port was not a piece of equipment you could pack in a transport ship. Harbors were massive, permanent structures requiring years of construction and millions of tons of material. You could not simply build one in Britain and tow it across the English Channel. But Hughes Howlett was not mad. He was echoing an idea that had been circulating in British planning circles for some time, an idea championed by the one man whose authority could transform the impossible into the merely difficult. As early as 1917, during the First World War, Winston Churchill had proposed building artificial harbors for an amphibious assault on the German-held Frisian Islands. At that time, Churchill served as First Sea Lord, and his fertile imagination constantly generated schemes that military professionals dismissed as fantasy. The Frisian Island concept was shelved as impractical, another Churchillian flight of fancy that ignored operational reality. Now, a quarter-century later, Churchill had become prime minister of a nation fighting for survival. His authority was absolute, his imagination had not dimmed, and the disaster at Dieppe had proven that something had to change. 3 months before the catastrophe at Dieppe, on May 30th, 1942, Churchill sent a memorandum to Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations. The memo, titled Piers for Use on Beaches, would become one of the most consequential documents of the Second World War. Its text was characteristically Churchillian, direct, and impossible to ignore. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. In those 2 sentences, Churchill captured the essence of what would make the Mulberry Harbors possible. He was not asking if it could be done. He was not soliciting opinions on feasibility. He was not calling for studies or committees. He was demanding action. The Prime Minister of Great Britain wanted floating piers. The engineering difficulties were someone else's problem. The day after Churchill issued his famous memo, a letter arrived on the desk of Hugh Eoris Hughes, a Welsh civil engineer working for the War Office Transportation Department. Hughes was no military man. He was a harbor specialist who had spent his career designing and building conventional port facilities. Now he received orders that must have seemed like a practical joke. He was to prepare proposals for landing piers that could be towed across the English Channel. Hughes immediately grasped both the enormity of the challenge and its revolutionary potential. He did not waste time arguing that it could not be done. Instead, he began designing solutions. Over the following weeks, Hughes developed concepts for massive concrete caissons he called hippos. These hollow structures would float when empty, be towed across the channel by tugboats, and then be sunk in position by flooding their internal compartments with seawater. Lined up in rows, they would form breakwaters to create sheltered water. The principle was simple. The execution would be anything but. Between June 17th and August 6th, 1942, Hughes submitted increasingly refined designs to the War Office. His Hippo caissons evolved in size and capability. The engineering firm of Oscar Faber was brought in to validate and improve the concepts. What emerged from this collaboration would eventually be known as Phoenix caissons, the foundation of the entire Mulberry system. But Phoenix caissons alone would not create a working harbor.
Breakwaters could protect ships from waves, but soldiers and tanks still needed a way to get from ship to shore. The Allies needed floating roadways, and these roadways had to accomplish something never before attempted in history. They had to rise and fall with the massive Normandy tides, which ranged up to 24 feet between high and low water, while simultaneously supporting tanks, trucks, and the constant traffic of an army on the move. Enter Alan Beckett, a major in the Royal Engineers who would become one of the unsung heroes of the Second World War. Beckett worked in the War Office Transportation Department, codenamed TN5, where he had been thinking about floating bridges and pier systems. When Churchill's memo electrified the planning process, Beckett was ready with solutions. He designed the Whale Floating Roadway System, an ingenious solution consisting of steel spans 80 feet long, supported by concrete pontoons called beetles. Each span weighed between 28 and 30 tons. The roadways were designed with 40 degrees of torsional flexibility, allowing them to twist and flex with the waves while maintaining their structural integrity. Vehicles could drive on them at speed, even as the sea churned beneath. 670 beetle pontoons would be manufactured. 120 bridge spans would be constructed. Together, they would form 10 miles of floating roadway, enough to connect the offshore piers to beaches half a mile distant. But the most critical element of Beckett's contribution was his solution to what Churchill had identified as the central challenge, the anchor problem. Traditional ship anchors were hopelessly inadequate for securing massive floating structures in the unpredictable waters of the English Channel. A Phoenix caisson weighing 6,000 tons could not be held in place by conventional means. The floating roadways would be torn apart by currents and waves if their moorings failed. Everything depended on solving the anchor problem. Beckett invented the kite anchor, a revolutionary design that looked nothing like traditional anchors. Instead of relying on weight and flukes to grip the seabed, the kite anchor used the force of the water itself. As current or waves pulled on the cable, the anchor's shape caused it to dig deeper into the sand. The harder you pulled, the tighter it held. The results were astonishing. A kite anchor weighing just 330 kilograms could hold 30 tons of pulling force. That represented 90 times its own weight, a performance that traditional anchors could not approach. Beckett had solved a problem that engineers had struggled with for centuries. The British Navy was so skeptical of Beckett's claims that they refused to use kite anchors for the floating breakwaters called bombardants. Traditional anchors, they insisted, were good enough for those structures. That decision, born of institutional conservatism, would prove costly in the weeks ahead. In August and September of 1943, the competing designs were put to the ultimate test at Galveston in Scotland. This remote location was chosen because its 24-foot tides matched those expected at Normandy. Workers evacuated the local population to maintain secrecy, and engineers prepared to subject 3 prototype roadway systems to the worst conditions they could simulate. Ronald Hamilton, working at the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, had designed a floating roadway called the Swiss Roll. It consisted of waterproofed canvas stiffened with wooden slats and tensioned by tables, forming a flexible mat that could support vehicles while rolling with the waves. The concept looked promising on paper, elegant in its simplicity. Then a genuine storm struck Galveston, far worse than any test the engineers had planned. Waves hammered the experimental structures with the same fury they would face in the channel.
The Swiss roll was torn to pieces, its canvas shredded, and its cables snapped by forces no amount of theoretical calculation had predicted. When the weather cleared, Beckett's whale system stood undamaged. The decision was made. The Mulberry Harbors would be built using Beckett's designs. Phoenix caissons would form the main breakwaters. Whale roadways would connect the offshore pierheads to the beaches. Spud pierheads, massive platforms mounted on steel legs that could be raised and lowered with the tides, would provide the loading points for ships. Old vessels would be deliberately sunk to form additional breakwaters called gooseberries, and floating steel breakwaters called bombardons would form the outer defensive ring against the worst of the Channel waves. That same month, Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff crossed the Atlantic aboard the liner Queen Mary for the Quebec Conference with President Roosevelt. Somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, senior officers crowded into one of the ship's luxurious bathrooms for what may have been the most consequential demonstration of the entire war. Professor John Bernal, a physicist known simply as Sage, had prepared a simple experiment. He floated paper ships in the bathtub, while Lieutenant Commander Grant created waves with a backbrush. A Mae West life preserver, the inflatable vest worn by pilots over water, served as a miniature breakwater. The assembled admirals and generals watched as the paper ships in the sheltered water behind the life preserver remained stable, while those outside were swamped by the waves. It was a child's demonstration, almost embarrassingly simple, but it communicated in seconds what hours of briefings could not convey. The physics were sound, the concept would work. Admiral Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord, had arrived skeptical. He departed convinced. The Quebec Conference gave formal approval for 2 full-scale artificial harbors to be constructed and deployed for the invasion of Europe. The approval came in August 1943. D-Day was originally planned for May 1944, later postponed to June 6th. That gave British industry less than a year to accomplish something never before attempted in human history. The scale of what followed defies comprehension. Across Britain, construction began at over 28 coastal sites. From the Thames estuary to the Clyde in Scotland, from Southampton and Portsmouth to Conway Morpha in Wales, an army of workers began assembling the components of the impossible harbors. More than 45,000 workers at over 300 companies labored round the clock. The East India docks in London were filled with rubble from the Blitz, creating new construction yards on the ashes of German bombing. Tilbury, Southampton, Stokes Bay, Lee, Middlesbrough, and the River Clyde all became manufacturing centers for different components of the Mulberry system. Major construction firms that would become household names participated in the effort. Costain, Balfour, Beatty, Henry Boot, Bovis, John Lang, McAlpine, Mallam, Nuttall, Taylor Woodrow, the entire British construction industry mobilized for a single project, though most workers had no idea what they were building. The statistics are staggering. Each completed harbor would be the size of Dover, the largest port in England, covering approximately 1.5 miles of ocean. Together, they would require approximately 1.5 million tons of material, 600,000 tons of concrete, 50,000 tons of steel, 120 miles of steel cable. The Phoenix caissons alone represented an engineering achievement that would have been considered remarkable in peacetime. 213 of these massive concrete structures were built in 6 different sizes. The largest measured 200 feet long by 56 feet wide by 60 feet tall, displacing 6,000 tons each. Construction required 330,000 cubic yards of concrete, enough to build a small city. Nearly half of Britain's entire cement production for months was diverted to the project. 146 of the Phoenix caissons would ultimately be towed to Normandy. The rest served as spares or were lost during the dangerous Channel crossing. The whale roadway sections were manufactured at facilities scattered across southern England. The spud pierheads, based on designs of the Lobnit Company of Renfrew in Scotland, incorporated technology originally developed for rock-cutting dredges. Each pierhead measured 200 feet by 60 feet, mounted on 4 massive steel legs that could be raised and lowered with electric motors to compensate for tidal changes. The Bombardan floating breakwaters presented their own challenges. 93 of these 200-foot by 25-foot cruciform structures were constructed of 20,000 tons of steel and rubberized canvas. They were designed to absorb wave energy at the outer perimeter of the harbor, protecting the more vulnerable Phoenix caissons inside. The gooseberry block ships required a different kind of preparation. 61 obsolete vessels were collected from ports around Britain and prepared for their final voyage. Among them were warships with distinguished histories.
At Omaha Beach, Mulberry A faced the full fury of the storm with insufficient protection. The Bombardan floating breakwaters, whose securing cables had used standard anchors rather than Beckett's kite design because the Navy had not trusted his specifications, broke loose and became battering rams. They smashed into the Phoenix caissons, which had not yet been pumped full of sand for additional stability. The waves pounded the floating roadways, twisting the steel spans and snapping cables. Whale sections that had survived the channel crossing were torn apart. Beetle pontoons were driven onto the beach or pulled under the waves. The careful engineering of 1,000 workers dissolved into chaos. By June 22nd, the American harbor was destroyed. 21 of the 28 Phoenix caissons in the breakwater had been wrecked beyond repair. The piers were described by observers as tangled like steel wool. Over 800 vessels lay washed up on the beaches, creating a junkyard where days before there had been a functioning port. General Omar Bradley surveyed the destruction and declared that the desolation vastly exceeded that of D-Day itself. Allied forces had only 3 days of ammunition remaining. If the supply line could not be restored, the entire invasion might fail. At Arromanches, Mulberry B fought the same storm with critical advantages. The natural Calvados Reef offshore provided some protection from the worst waves. British engineers had taken more care with anchoring procedures. Most importantly, Beckett's whale roadways with their kite anchors demonstrated exactly the resilience their designer had promised, flexing and bending where more rigid structures simply broke. The British harbor was damaged but not destroyed. The decision was made quickly, driven by desperate necessity. Mulberry A would not be rebuilt. Salvageable components, including massive caissons that had survived largely intact, would be towed to Arromanches to reinforce Mulberry B. The Phoenix units would be pumped full of sand to provide greater stability against any future storms. The American beaches would continue operations without an artificial harbor, using a method that surprised everyone involved. Direct beach unloading with LST landing ships and DUKW amphibious vehicles proved far more effective than anyone had predicted. The favorable soil conditions at Omaha, which allowed heavy construction equipment to cut beaching channels for landing ships, had been impossible to anticipate before the invasion. Within days of the storm subsiding, both American beaches at Omaha and Utah were handling over 16,000 tons of supplies per day. By the end of June, they were processing more tonnage than the surviving Mulberry. This unexpected success led some critics to question whether the entire Mulberry project had been a waste of resources. Rear Admiral John Leslie Hall of the United States Navy was blunt in his assessment. "I think it is the biggest waste of manpower and equipment that I have ever seen," he wrote. "I can unload 1,000 LSTs at a time over the open beaches. Why give me something that anybody who has ever seen the sea act upon 150-ton concrete blocks at Casablanca knows the first storm will destroy? What is the use of building them just to have them destroyed and litter up the beaches?" The debate over Mulberry's value continues among historians to this day. But this criticism, however understandable from a frustrated commander, misses crucial points. The very beaches that allowed such effective unloading were only accessible because the Phoenix caissons and Gooseberry block ships had created sheltered water. Without the breakwaters, the beach operations Hall praised would have been impossible.
The calm seas behind even the damaged structures made DUKW operations practical. Moreover, certain cargoes could only be handled through the artificial harbor. The specialized pier heads designed for Mulberry B were essential for heavy vehicles, bridging equipment, oversized artillery pieces, and loads that simply could not roll off landing craft onto sand. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for Mulberry's importance comes from what it actually accomplished in the months that followed. Mulberry B, which came to be known as Port Winston after the Prime Minister who had championed its creation, was designed to operate for 90 days until captured ports could be restored. It remained in service for 10 months, finally being decommissioned in November 1944, only after the captured port of Antwerp became available. During that time, the Arromanches sector, including Port Winston and its surrounding beach operations, facilitated the landing of approximately 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. The daily average from June 20th through September 1st was 6,765 tons, 13% above the design specification of 6,000 tons per day. The peak single day came on July 29, 1944, when 11,491 tons crossed the piers. The peak week, ending July 31st, saw 71,043 tons delivered to the Allied armies fighting their way across France. These numbers decided battles. They supplied the fuel that drove Patton's tanks across France. They delivered the ammunition that broke the German lines at Caen. They brought the reinforcements that turned the Battle of the Bulge. They won a war. When Cherbourg finally fell to American forces on June 26th, they found exactly what they expected. The Germans had demolished the harbor so thoroughly that it would take months to restore. Every crane had been destroyed. Every dock had been mined. The first supply ship did not enter Cherbourg until July 16th. By that time, Mulberry B had already landed 1 million tons of supplies. The Germans had made their ports impregnable, and the Allies had simply gone around them. Albert Speer understood this better than anyone.
The man who had overseen the construction of the Atlantic Wall, who had poured Germany's dwindling resources into concrete and steel to defend harbors that would never be attacked, recognized the strategic genius of what the Allies had accomplished. 13 million cubic meters of concrete, 1.5 million tons of steel, all of it rendered worthless by an idea of simple genius. Today, more than 80 years after D-Day, the remains of Mulberry B are still visible at Arromanches. At low tide, the phoenix caissons emerge from the water like the bones of some massive prehistoric creature. Several still stand approximately 20 meters high, monuments weighing up to 6,000 tons each, silent witnesses to the largest amphibious operation in military history. The Musée de Débarquement at Arromanches was the first D-Day museum in the world, opened in 1954 and recently renovated in 2022 and 2023. Visitors can see detailed models showing exactly how the harbor components fit together. A memorial to Alan Beckett overlooks the waterfront, featuring a preserved whale section and a replica of his revolutionary kite anchor. In October 2018, 5 original kite anchors were recovered from the bed of the Solent off Woodside Beach, where they had lain since being used assembly points for the whale tows before D-Day. They were taken to Mary Rose Archaeological Services in Portsmouth for conservation, artifacts of a moment when engineering and courage changed the world. At Thor Bay in Southend-on-Sea, a phoenix caisson that began leaking while being towed and was intentionally beached still sits on a sandbank in the Thames estuary. It was designated as a scheduled monument in 2004. At low tide, visitors can walk out and touch the same concrete that was meant to shelter the armies of liberation. Other remnants are scattered across the English coast and the beaches of Normandy, silent witnesses to an achievement that seemed impossible until it was done. Phoenix caissons at Pagham Harbor, 10 more at Portland Harbor that were refloated in 1946 for other uses. Whale sections were repurposed after the war as bridges across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, their final missions peaceful.
Leon Dong, an American engineer who surveyed the wreckage of Mulberry A after the Great Storm, looked at the twisted metal and shattered concrete and saw something beyond destruction. He envisioned piers that could be elevated above the waves before storms struck, platforms that could ride out any weather by simply rising above it. His concept of the jack-up platform would eventually transform the offshore oil industry. Every drilling rig in the Gulf of Mexico, every production platform in the North Sea, traces its lineage to an idea born in the wreckage of an artificial harbor on a French beach in June 1944. The Mulberry Harbors were not perfect. They were not invincible. One was destroyed by nature in 3 days. The other required constant repair and reinforcement. Critics can and have argued that the resources devoted to their construction might have been better spent elsewhere. But criticism comes easy when you already know how the story ends. In the spring of 1944, no one knew that the Normandy beaches would prove suitable for direct unloading. No one could predict that the desperate improvisation after Mulberry's destruction would work as well as it did. The planners had to make decisions based on what they knew, and what they knew was DEP. What the Mulberry Harbors truly represent is something beyond logistics or engineering. They represent the Allied refusal to accept that anything was impossible. When the Germans said no invasion could succeed without a port, the Allies built their own. When experts said you could not tow a harbor across the ocean, 45,000 workers proved them wrong. The Germans were not stupid. Their logic was sound. Their engineers were excellent. Their fortifications were masterfully designed. They simply could not imagine that anyone would do what the Allies did because it had never been done before. It was not failure of intelligence. It was failure of imagination. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. In every generation, there are those who look at impossible problems and declare them impossible. And in every generation, there are those who refuse to listen, who insist that where there is a will, there must be a way, who bet everything on the chance that human ingenuity can overcome any obstacle. 80 years ago, the beaches of Normandy witnessed what happens when audacity meets determination. 2.5 million men crossed an artificial harbor that was not supposed to exist, carrying 4 million tons of supplies that were not supposed to reach them, to fight a war that was not supposed to be won this way. The concrete still stands at Aramash. The tide still rises and falls around the Phoenix caissons twice each day, just as it did when the first tanks rolled ashore. And the lesson endures, written in steel and stone, and the sacrifice of those who refuse to accept the impossible. Sometimes the only way forward is to build what has never been built before. Thank you for watching. If this story of courage, ingenuity, and determination moved you, please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing it with others who appreciate the extraordinary achievements of ordinary people in extraordinary times. These stories deserve to be remembered. Together, we can make sure they are never forgotten.